The decision was delivered without ceremony, without warning, and with a finality that made the room feel suddenly smaller. Harry's name, once attached to privileged access surrounding Diana's private archive, had been removed from the palace-controlled record. But the true shock came seconds later. William did not celebrate. He did not walk away. Instead, the future king stepped forward, looked directly at the officials responsible, and asked one question that changed the entire meaning of the decision. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Harry received the notice away from the palace and said nothing. He read it twice, staring at the sentence confirming his removal from the authorized access register. That register was simply the palace list, identifying who could consult protected material without seeking fresh approval each time. Diana's private archive, a fictional family collection kept apart from ordinary public royal records, held letters, recordings, handwritten reflections, photographs, and pieces of family memory, preserving the woman behind the global symbol. William learned of the change moments before it became operational, and his expression hardened. The prince asked whether his brother had been warned personally, and whether anyone had considered what it meant to remove a son's recognized access to his mother's private words. A senior administrator answered through a documented internal briefing that the action was not punishment. It came from a wider review of palace-linked rights after family members left official royal duties, separating personal relationships from institutional privilege. Harry's silence turned into disbelief because the loss felt larger than procedure. He had left royal work, but he had never imagined that choice could reshape how he reached memories of Diana that existed nowhere else. William, despite years of tension with him, understood the difference immediately. The future king did not defend every choice his brother had made, but he refused to let palace boundaries become a judgment on whether Harry still belonged beside their mother's memory. William moved before the administrator could lift the document. He placed one hand across the page and said the administrative decision could stand for the moment, but Diana's sons would not be treated like interchangeable names on a registry. Nobody answered. The silence carried the real shock. The question was no longer why Harry had lost access. It was why William, after years of fracture, had suddenly decided this was the line he would not let the palace cross. And to understand that intervention, the story has to leave the paperwork behind and return to two brothers who inherited the same grief, then learned to carry it in completely different ways. Long before titles separated them, long before interviews, departures, accusations, and frozen palace corridors, William and Harry belonged to the same private tragedy. Diana was not simply an icon whose possessions could be indexed and protected. She was their mother. That is why removing one brother's name from her archive carried an emotional force no administrative explanation could contain, and why William's reaction exposed something the palace had spent years pretending could be separated from constitutional duty. Harry kept the notification open and read one sentence again: no continuing entitlement. The words felt colder than the restriction itself. A working royal is a family member carrying out official duties on behalf of the monarch, and he had stepped away from that role. But leaving royal work had never meant leaving Diana. The private archive mattered because it held traces of her before history turned her into an icon. Letters, recordings, reflections, and family memories belonging to the sons who knew her as their mother. William carried a different burden. The prince remained inside the institution, bound to duties Harry had rejected, yet it did not erase years of anger between them. In a private conversation with Catherine, recorded in a fictional family account, he admitted he was furious with his brother. Still, he said he would not allow disagreement over royal life to become a judgment on whether Harry was entitled to remember Diana. Catherine listened, and she understood what was at stake. Catherine asked the question William had been avoiding. If he challenged the decision, would palace officials accuse him of reopening privileges his brother had surrendered? The future king knew they might. He had defended firm boundaries before. Now those same boundaries threatened to make him look inconsistent. Worse, they could turn a personal act into a political concession when, to him, it was nothing of the kind. William removed his glasses, folded the notification, and set it down. "This is not about his title," he told Catherine. She held his gaze before answering that perhaps the palace had forgotten the same distinction. The words stayed with him because they cut through years of resentment with precision. Harry might no longer serve the crown, but he had never stopped being Diana's son. Then another detail surfaced. William learned through the documented archive review that the removal had not begun with the announcement. Months earlier, Harry had attended a private archive appointment, spoken with an archivist, and asked about a sealed box carrying Diana's handwriting. What happened in that room changed everything. Because behind the official announcement lay one encounter everyone remembered differently, and that encounter became the trigger that finally pushed palace officials toward Harry's removal. The chain of events did not begin with a committee, a legal review, or William's intervention. It began months earlier, with one sealed archival box, and a request that seemed almost painfully simple. Harry wanted access to material connected to Diana's private correspondence. The archivist hesitated. Harry pressed harder, and within minutes, a conversation meant to last quietly behind closed doors became the incident palace officials would later cite as the point when emotional ownership collided directly with institutional control. Harry had never held unrestricted possession of the archive. His access had developed through family understandings, custodial rules, and palace procedures that controlled who could handle protected private material. A custodian, in this context, was simply a person responsible for safeguarding the collection and enforcing its access conditions. After he left official royal duties, his visits increasingly required coordination through those custodians, creating frustration without completely severing his connection to Diana's papers. Harry arrived at the private appointment already carrying that frustration. According to the fictional written account later placed in the archive review file, he asked to temporarily remove a sealed box containing copies of Diana's handwritten letters so they could be examined independently outside palace custody. The archivist refused. No protected item, she explained, could leave without joint authorization. He heard something harsher. To him, the palace was treating his own mother's words like property he needed permission to touch. Harry pushed back. He told the archivist he could not spend the rest of his life asking officials for approval simply to understand his own family. She remained shaken but composed, and answered that the same restriction applied to William. That name changed the temperature instantly. His anger shifted. The issue was no longer only the box. It touched the deeper wound of one brother remaining inside the system, while the other stood outside it. The archivist documented the exchange that same day. She made clear that Harry had issued no threat, but his request exposed an unresolved institutional problem. Could someone who had left working royal life continue exercising privileges created through palace structures? That question mattered, because any exception could alter future access rules far beyond one family dispute. The account moved upward, and quietly, the machinery began turning. Months later, William found the summary inside the review papers. The prince stopped at one handwritten margin note beside the incident. Review continuing access status. He read it twice. Then he asked who had authorized the review. The answer unsettled him. The decision reached far beyond one archivist. And that discovery sent William straight toward the confrontation he had been trying to avoid, because the person defending the decision was ready to tell him that sentiment could not be allowed to rewrite palace boundaries. William did not summon a crowd. He did not arrive with lawyers, public statements, or threats. He entered a private palace room where two senior custodial officials were waiting, closed the door behind himself, and placed Harry's removal notice on the table. What followed was not an argument over privilege. It became a confrontation over something far more personal: whether palace discipline had quietly crossed the line between protecting the crown and deciding who was entitled to remain Diana's son. William listened as the officials defended the decision in a documented fictional briefing. They explained that Harry's authorization had depended partly on palace responsibility, security, custody, and institutional accountability. An authorization framework was simply the set of internal rules determining who could enter, inspect, or handle protected material. The prince accepted one uncomfortable truth immediately. Leaving official royal duties had consequences. He was not asking for his brother's former office, security arrangements, or ceremonial privileges to be restored. One official pushed harder. Exceptions, he warned, became precedents, and precedents weakened rules meant to protect private holdings. William's jaw tightened. He understood the logic, but he hated hearing Diana's memory discussed like an administrative risk. Harry had made choices that damaged trust, he said, but those choices did not transform their mother into a privilege granted only to whichever son remained inside palace life. William leaned forward. He may have left the working monarchy, but he did not resign as her son. The official held his ground and answered that the palace could not administer grief. The future king did not raise his voice. He simply replied that perhaps the institution should stop pretending grief had nothing to do with the decision. The silence afterward was sharper than shouting, because everyone in the room understood the accusation. The second official finally clarified what had actually been removed. Harry had not been erased from Diana's family history, nor had access become impossible. Only his automatic palace-administered status had ended. An authorized custodian, a person formally empowered to supervise protected family material, could still approve individual visits. William immediately asked whose authorization would be enough. The official opened another folder. William saw his own name. For several seconds, the prince said nothing. The palace had removed Harry's independent route to Diana's archive, while quietly giving his brother the power to let him back inside. What looked like a compromise now felt like a trap. Accepting it would make William the gatekeeper to memories they had once shared equally. He closed the folder and asked who had designed that arrangement. And that was where confrontation became something more dangerous. Power. Because William now needed to discover exactly who controlled Diana's archive, and whether his own authority could be used to dismantle the very system that had placed two sons on opposite sides of the same locked door. The palace may look powerful from the outside, but private family material follows rules very different from crowns, residences, and public records. William quickly discovers that nobody, not even the monarch, can simply walk into Diana's private archive and rewrite its custodial structure on impulse. Yet one person does possess enough authority to alter what happens next. The uncomfortable truth is that the palace has made William part of the very system he is questioning. William studies the distinction carefully, because it changes everything. The royal archives are the official historical records preserved for the monarchy, while Diana's private family collection exists under a fictional custodial agreement governing preservation, supervised access, and family consultation. That agreement matters because Harry's removal does not erase his relationship to the material, nor does it transfer ownership to his brother. It changes only the route through which he can reach it. William takes that question directly to Charles in a private conversation, later documented in a fictional family account. The prince asks whether the king personally supported the removal. Charles hesitates. He says he supported clear boundaries after Harry left official royal life, but not the emotional consequences now unfolding. The monarch knows the distinction sounds reasonable until Diana's name enters the room, and then every procedural answer feels suddenly inadequate. Charles turns Harry's notification over on the desk without reading it aloud. The king's discomfort deepens when his eyes catch Diana's name in the opening paragraph. He had wanted order, not another wound. William sees that hesitation and presses harder, asking whether anyone considered how humiliating it would be for his brother to request permission from him every time he wanted supervised access. William already knows the answer. As a direct family custodian, he can approve Harry's entry under the revised structure. But that power feels wrong. Every future visit would force one brother to ask and the other to decide. Years of resentment would sit behind every request, turning their mother into another arena where pride and authority could collide. Charles finally asks what the prince intends to do. William closes the folder. "I'm not going to make him ask me every time he wants his mother." The king looks up sharply. He understands at once that his son is no longer considering a one-time exception. William is preparing to challenge the mechanism itself. But before he can act, Harry receives a second message explaining exactly what the new arrangement means. And rules that sound measured inside a palace office feel very different when they arrive on a son's screen and tell him that the next memory of his mother may require his brother's permission. Harry had already absorbed the humiliation of seeing his name removed, but the second message hurt differently. It explained that future access could still be requested through an authorized family custodian, and William was among those empowered to approve it. For a few seconds, Harry simply stared. The palace had not completely locked him away from Diana. It had done something he considered almost worse. It had placed his connection to her behind a door his estranged brother could now open or close. Harry read the explanation again, because the distinction mattered. A standing authorization was simply an ongoing right to request supervised access without needing a new family approval each time, and that direct status was now gone. The palace viewed the replacement arrangement as a practical compromise. He saw something more personal. Permission had replaced entitlement, and every future request now carried the possibility of dependence on the brother from whom he had become painfully distant. Meghan watched him struggle with the wording, and asked whether William would actually refuse him. Harry looked up immediately. "That was not the point," he said. The wound was having to ask at all. She understood the humiliation beneath his anger, and pressed no further. He had already lost his place inside the working monarchy. Now he feared that institutional separation was reaching into memories that had existed long before either brother understood titles or duty. Harry turned his phone face down. He said quietly that Diana had spent so much of her life resisting being reduced to palace procedure, only for her private words to become another institutional negotiation after her death. Meghan heard the sadness replacing the anger. To him, the archive was not a collection of historical objects. It was one of the few remaining places where his mother had not yet been transformed completely into public history. Then the phone moved again. Harry looked down and saw a direct message from William. "Do not submit an access request yet. I'm changing this." He read it once, then again. The anger did not disappear, but something inside him shifted. Until that moment, Harry had assumed his brother had either accepted the restriction or quietly benefited from it. Now the prince appeared to be resisting the very power the palace had placed in his hands. Meghan asked what William meant. He could only shake his head. Harry picked up the phone again. For the first time since the original notice arrived, he stopped asking what the palace was doing to him and started asking what his brother was trying to prevent. And when William finally answered that question directly, neither man was prepared for how quickly an argument over Diana's archive would become an argument about everything they had never managed to say to each other. By sunrise, the story was no longer about an access register hidden inside palace administration. It was everywhere. Broadcasters debated whether Harry had finally been cut away from Diana's private legacy, while others focused on the extraordinary intervention of the brother from whom he had become most distant. Then one newspaper front page appeared across stands outside Windsor, carrying an image of Diana between her two sons, beneath 4 words that instantly captured the public mood: "She belongs to both." Harry saw the front page and stopped. He hated becoming a symbol again, especially when private pain was being turned into public argument. But this image felt different. For once, it did not frame him against William. It placed both brothers beside Diana, reminding people that before royal duty, departure and division, they had shared the same loss. The debate itself had split sharply, because palace-linked authorization simply meant access connected to official royal structures, while Diana's private legacy carried emotional meaning far beyond those structures. William watched the coverage with Catherine and grew visibly uncomfortable as commentators described him as the brother who had rescued Harry. The prince rejected that language immediately. He told her he had not rescued anyone. He had corrected a system that should never have placed 2 sons in competition over their mother's memory. Catherine understood why the praise unsettled him. Success in changing the arrangement could not erase the suffering that had made the change necessary. Outside Kensington Palace, the argument became painfully human. A small crowd gathered near the gates, and several people left white flowers beside handwritten cards carrying Diana's name. One message stood out. A mother is not a privilege. The words spread quickly, because they reduced weeks of palace logic to one emotional truth. What officials had described as procedure, the public increasingly understood as family. Then the palace confirmed the revised arrangement through a formal statement. Harry's former palace-linked authorization remained ended, preserving the institutional consequence of leaving official duties. But a separate protected family mechanism now gave both sons equal Diana-specific access. William no longer held unilateral control over whether his brother could enter. The future king had deliberately surrendered that power. Harry read the confirmation without celebration. William did the same. Neither man had won everything, but neither had allowed Diana to become a weapon between them. And with the procedural battle finally settled, one question remained. What did this choice say about Harry's place in the family after everything that had happened? The final answer would come not through another announcement, but through the meaning of the compromise itself, and through what two brothers had chosen, at last, not to take away from each other. In the end, Harry did lose something. His old palace-linked access disappeared, and William did not restore the royal privileges that had existed before the brothers' lives took separate paths. But something more important survived. Diana's memory was removed from the battlefield. William refused to become the man who decided when Harry was allowed to reach their mother, and Harry accepted that preserving that bond did not require pretending nothing else between him and the monarchy had changed. Harry remained outside the institutional position he once held. He did not regain his former office, general palace privileges, or automatic standing within royal structures, and that boundary mattered because leaving official duty still carried real consequences. But Diana-specific material now sat under a revised family access framework, meaning a separate set of rules gave both sons equal standing when dealing with their mother's private archive. The distinction was deliberate. Royal employment could change, but their relationship to Diana could not be ranked by status. William signed the revised authorization and paused before returning the pen. The prince knew the document had not repaired years of anger, distance, and mistrust. It had not erased interviews, accusations, departures, or the bitterness that had hardened between them. But it had removed one weapon from every future argument. Their mother would not become something either brother could withhold from the other. Harry received the confirmation and did not celebrate. He offered no triumphant statement and made no attempt to frame the outcome as a victory over the palace. His response, recorded in the fictional family account surrounding the settlement, was restrained. He acknowledged the change and left it there. That silence carried its own meaning. The fight was no longer about defeating an institution. It was about protecting one part of his identity from becoming another casualty of the conflict. William later returned to the original page, showing Harry's name struck from the old register. He placed the revised equal access authorization beside it. One document represented everything that had changed between the brothers. The other represented the line he had refused to let change. Charles accepted the final structure because it preserved both truths exposed by the crisis. The king maintained that stepping away from royal duty had institutional consequences, but he also accepted that family memory could not be reduced entirely to palace employment. Diana had been a public figure, but to William and Harry, she remained something far simpler, deeper, and more permanent: their mother. Harry's name disappeared from one palace register, but William ensured it was never erased from the place that mattered most, and in doing so, the brothers reached a rare, painful agreement. The crown could govern their roles, but it would never own their mother. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.